Hey everybody, welcome back to another Python tutorial. In today's video, we're going to continue our deep dive into the Win32com library, but we're going to be talking about a particular object that is used very heavily behind the scenes inside of the Win32com library. Now, if you remember a while ago, I had a video that discussed early versus late binding inside of Win32com. And with early binding, all we saw was that it would basically run this file called makepy, this Python script really, and it would generate a Python file that contained all the methods and properties for any given object that we specified. And so you could always find this particular file if you went to your local disk, users, yourself, app data, local temp, and then genpy, and then the version of Python. And then basically what it was the CLS ID, the major version number, and then the minor version number, and I can't remember what the last one is, but something like that. And then so in this example, this is my application object. Well, I already have it open, and it's my Excel application. My Excel application object. Now, this was all auto-generated, but you'll notice that inside of it are the different objects, the class objects, that belong to that particular application object. So in this case, for the Excel application, there's an object called dialog sheets. And inside that particular object, there are methods. And at first, you're kind of looking at this like, and it looks all funny and stuff. You're like, what is all this information? It's just basically the name of the method. It looks like it's got some arguments and everything like that. And then it calls itself, so the object itself, it goes into this OLE object and it calls this Invoke Types method, whatever that is. And then it just seems to pass through a bunch of stuff that I have no idea what it is. Well, we're going to basically recreate this little section of code right here. We're going to see what the Invoke Types method is and what particular object that belongs to, because behind the scenes, it's leveraging something called a dispatch interface. And a dispatch interface is our way of communicating with our com object, so with our particular dialog sheets com object. So a lot of good information in the video up ahead. I'm not going to necessarily say you would be leveraging this directly, but it's very important to understand how this is all being constructed and why it's being constructed the way it is. So that way, when you look back at this code, you're not going, what's going on? I don't understand what any of this means. You would be looking at it and going, okay, I kind of see what's going on. It's just creating this and it's passing through this and that. So we are going to be using a library. It's going to be Pythoncom. We've used this library before. We've seen it used with different things related to getting constants, to connecting to existing objects and stuff like that. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is I want to connect to a particular actively running com object. So I'm going to insert a cell below. And in this case, I want to connect to my Excel application. And so I'm going to store it in a new variable called IDispatch. And so I'll just say connect to my existing Excel application object. And so what this is going to do is we're going to call our Pythoncom library, and then we're going to call the connect method, and then we just pass through the program ID. So in this case, it's the Excel application. And then what is returned back to us? We now have something called a PyIDispatch object. So now brings us to the next component. What is a dispatch object and why are they important? Well, I think it's important to kind of just give you a high-level overview of kind of what COM is. COM stands for Component Object Model. The important thing about this kind of framework is it allows us to work with an object regardless of what language that object was implemented in. So say Excel was implemented in C. It doesn't matter if it was implemented in C or C++. With the COM framework, I can still work with those objects inside of Python, JavaScript, whatever you want to work with, regardless of the language it was implemented in. The reason why is it basically has some predefined standards that allow us to kind of always know what to expect from it. So there's always these predefined methods we can do to then go and get some information about that particular object. And then once we have the information about that object, we can invoke its methods and properties using different methods or different functions that belong to something called the dispatch interface. The interface is really our kind of way of communicating with that object. So again, with the interface, this is how I'm communicating with that object in a very standardized way. So that way, I don't have to worry about the language it was implemented in. I have a framework with communicating with that object. And really, that standard is kind of defined in the binary code itself. So inside the binary code itself, we have that standard kind of locked away. And so because it's at such a low level, we can simply, interact with it in a standard way. So very useful. So when we're connecting to an object, what is being sent back to us is the interface to communicate with that object. And so now that we have an interface, we can learn more about what it can do. So if you call the help function, you can get some more information about this particular interface object. So get some more information about our interface object. And what you'll notice is that there's some predefined methods. There's something called get ID of names, get type info, get type info count, invoke, and invoke types. And then there's some dunder methods that we don't really need to worry about at this point. So the dispatch interface is kind of a more specific type of interface. It's more designed for OLE objects. Again, that's for a later video, but at this point, you just need to know it's more related to OLE automation. So that's all you have to kind of keep in mind. But still, it's an interface, and still it has these predefined methods. What do these methods do? Well, maybe we want to learn about the methods and properties that belong to our Excel application. At this point, we don't know anything about it. Let's just assume. Well, we can use the get IDs of names method, pass through the method or property as a string, and if it does exist, it's going to return back something called a DISPID, which is a unique identifier for that particular method and property. And then what we can do is we can take what's returned back from here, if something is, and we can use it in our invoke and invoke types method. This will allow us to either get that property, set that property, or call that method. So we use the invoke and invoke types functions to call the method or get or set that property. We also have two other functions called getTypeInfo and getTypeInfoCount. GetTypeInfoCount returns the number of typeinfo objects that belong to our dispatch interface. Now, in all my time working with Win32, I have only seen it return back one number, which is 1. So it tells me that there is only one typeinfo object that belongs to my dispatch interface. The getTypeInfo returns that typeinfo object. And we'll see in a later video that there's a whole host of information that exists in that particular object, something that requires a whole video to dedicate to it just because it's so useful. And then there's some objects inside of that one that we can also do an entire video on. And we'll find that it gets us all the methods and properties that belong to it. So very useful. So again, you can always call the help function and it will always return some information back to you. Or if you want, you can go to the documentation for PyWin32. I'll be putting a link below and it will kind of guide you through a little bit. You do have to keep in mind some of this is very broad and not very detailed, and you're not going to find very many examples, if any at all. Now, in this example, I have the PyIDispatch object. It gives me a definition, and then it defines the methods and what those methods are supposed to be doing. Now, a lot of this stuff is also available in C++. So C++ is the way that we also can work with our COM objects. So if you go to the Microsoft documentation and you were to type in something like IDispatch, it's going to return you to the C++ documentation. This is more detailed. This will give you a better idea of kind of what these methods are and kind of what's expected, but you have to keep in mind, it's not going to line up perfectly with what you're seeing here. So you might see discrepancies. In fact, you might see differences. For example, inside of the Python documentation, there's something called invoke and invoke types. Inside of the C++ documentation, there is only a method called invoke. There is no invoke types. So you will find situations like this where one is going to be different than the other. But if you spend some time reading, you'll kind of start getting the framework as to what's the difference between the two and what you need to take from this to apply to your objects over here. So that's, again, just a high-level overview. I will be putting these document links down in the description below. But at this point, all we have to remember is that COM allows us in a standardized way to communicate with different objects regardless of what language they were implemented in. So if they were implemented in, C or whatever it is, we can still work with those objects inside of Python because there's this framework that allows us to do that. And there's this framework that allows us to communicate that. That framework is the dispatch interface. And the dispatch interface has different functions that we can use in order to get information about our particular object. So let's start running through some of the functions. The first particular one that I might want to be working with is the type info count, right? So I might be curious as to how many I might be curious as to how many type info objects there are in my particular object, right? Or my particular dispatch object. So what I'm going to do is get the number of type info objects that exist with my dispatch object. And that's really related to our actual COM object itself. So I'm going to say get type info count. So type info count equals my Excel dispatch interface. And I'm going to get the type info count. And then I should, I misspelled it a little bit. Type info count. There's only one. Like I said, every time I work with it, it's only returned one. So just, but supposedly there are situations where you can have more if there's more interfaces. For at least from what I was reading it, I might have gotten that wrong, but supposedly you still can have more than one. If I want to get that type info object, it's identical from this, but we're just going to change our code a tiny bit. So I'm going to remove that. I'm going to remove that, and I'm just going to remove that as well. And then I'm going to change this. So now I'm going to get the type info object. And we can see here, it's a type info object, and we can also call the help function on this. You will see there are more methods that we can use, and that this one has, again, a ton. We can get documentation strings, we can get function descriptions, we can get implied type flags, get names, type attribute, things like that. A lot of good information. Again, I've dedicated a whole video to this topic just because there is so much information here. So I'm going to just save that for a later day. All you need to know is that if you want to get that type info object, you call the get type info method, and then that will return the object. So the returned object. So this one tells me how many of those objects there are. This one returns that object back to me, and it has treasure trove of information. The next one that's very, very important is related to the invoke and the invoke type method. The invoke method and the invoke type method allow us to call our methods and properties, but that particular function requires a parameter called the dispid. That is the unique identifier that is related to our method and property. Well, we need to be able to ask our object, do you have a particular method or property? We use the get IDs of names function in order to ask that question. So maybe I'm curious, I have an Excel application object. I want to know, does it have a property called workbook? So does my Excel application have a property called workbook? And if so, what is the ID? Well, we'll store it in a variable called workbook ID. I'm going to call my Excel dispatch interface, my way to communicate with it, and I'm going to call my get IDs of names method. And then I'm going to pass through a string, which is the property that I want. Hopefully, there is one. Now, we've worked with Excel a lot, so there should be one, right? There is an ID. The DIS PID is 572. At this point, you just need to know it's a unique identifier for this particular property. Now, I used a property. How do we do it for methods? It's identical, literally identical. Does my Excel application have a method called quit? Well, let's check. We'll do that. And then we'll pass through the name of that method called quit. Lo and behold, it does have a method called quit, and the DIS PID is 302. Let's see what happens if we pass through a method or property that doesn't exist. Well, in this example, I'll pass through something called Bob. I know my Excel application does not have a method or property called Bob, so it should return nothing. And like it does, it returns an error. So basically the error is saying it doesn't exist, and it comes back and says unknown name. So basically we pass through a method or property that does not belong to this particular object. We'll see with the type attribute object, we can get a list of all the methods and properties of an object. So we can ask this question with 100% confidence. But that, again, is for a later video. So now that we have the DIS PID, what do we do with it? Well, we've seen before that we can invoke the methods and properties of our objects using Win32com, but really what is happening behind the scenes when we call those methods and properties? Well, really what it's doing is it's calling the invoke method or the invoke types method. Now, how did we kind of stumble across that? Well, again, remember back to that early binding video. It generated this file. And then with this file, we get each object that belongs to our, in this case, it was our application object. And then it defines each method for those objects. Each one of these methods is calling something called the invoke types. And most people when they first saw it, I know I did, I'm going, what is invoke types? Where is it used? This is related to that dispatch interface for this particular object. You can see it right up here. It's calling something called dispatch base class. It's calling our dispatch interface, and it's calling the invoke types method related to our dispatch interface. And then it passes through a bunch of stuff that at this point, we don't really know what it is. But in order to actually call this method, when we were calling it behind the scenes, it was calling the dispatch interface and then calling the invoke types method. That's what it's doing. So all we're doing is we're just recreating what's being done there, but now we're seeing kind of how it's working. So that way, when we look at this code, we're not going to be completely lost as to what all this stuff is. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's actually move to an example working with the DIS PID. In this example, let's work with the range property. So insert a cell below. And in this example, we'll start with I think it's the invoke one I have up next. I have to look at my notes really quickly. Invoke types. Yes, it's the invoke method. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, we need to first define a couple parameters. If you go to the documentation for this particular method and you just right click and open a new tab like me, and now you'll have 500 tabs like I did, you'll see that with the PyIDispatch object, there's a method called invoke. It takes a couple parameters, the DIS PID, something called an LCID, flags, bResultWanted, and some parameters. And then, in most cases, an object is returned back to us. Not always, but sometimes. The parameters are defined below, the data type that it's expecting, and then what that particular parameter is. Keep in mind, these are very broad sometimes, and it's not very clear as to what they actually are. At this point, we know what this one is. The local context ID, again, this is something, don't worry about it. It's pretty much always the same, but it's kind of more related to like language reference settings. The important one is flags. The flags is going to be saying, are we using a method, a property, and if it's a property, are we getting something or are we changing something? So that, again, is really the important part here. The flag is determining whether, when we're invoking it, are we invoking a method or are we invoking a property? And if a property, are we retrieving a property or are we changing a property? If there is a result, do we send it back to us? Well, if we define the bResultWanted, if we set it equal to false, we're saying, well, if there is something that was sent back to us, we don't want to see it. But if there is something, And if we set it equal to true, send it back to us. And then the parameters are simply the parameters for that particular method or property. And then there is that final note down here about the bResult parameter. God, I can't say that one if my life depended on it. I can't stand that one. Okay, so let's kind of walk through this particular method. So the first thing is we need to define the IDispatch of our range property. Well, we're just going to call, where is it? The get IDs of names. That's all we need to do. So we'll call the IDispatch object, and we'll ask it a question. Get IDs of names. So do you have a property called range? And if so, can you return it back to me, please? You do have a range property, and there is a IDispatch that is related to it. Let's now define the local context ID. Again, it's something related to language references. That's all you got to know at this point. Just put it 0x0. That's all. We need to now define the flags. Define the flags. We'll define it and call it wFlags. And that is going to equal our Pythoncom module. And then I can just call the constant that I want. In this case, I want dispatch property get. I'm going to get my range property. And we'll see that that just returns another object. So dispatch property get. Now, if you go into the code right here, you're going to see something called 1. Or in some cases, you'll see 2. Those are simply the constants. So if you see a 2, it's a property, and if it's a 1, it's a method. Now, I don't know about you, I don't like remembering constants, so what I decided to do is I did some research and I realized that you can go into your Pythoncom module and you can actually call up the constant. This will return the number that it needs to be. This, to me, is more user-friendly. Now, you can go to your heart's desire and put 2 out here. I'm not going to judge you, but to me, this was very hard to read. This is more intuitive. That's just my opinion. Now, the next question. Do we want the results back? Well, we'll define bResult wanted, and that will equal true. I want my object back, or whatever sent back, I want something. And now we'll define the parameters of our range property. Well, the range property takes a couple different parameters. It's just cell values, and those cells are going to be strings. So I'll define cell 1. That equals A1, and I'll define cell 2. That equals A2. So I want the range A1 to A2. I'll now invoke my method. So let's grab the range property. And I'll say my range dispatch. My mechanism to communicate with my range object. IDispatch, I'll call the invoke method. I'll pass through my range ID, my LC ID, my wFlags, my bResult wanted, my param1, well, sorry, not param1, cell 1, and then cell 2. And let's see if we get back anything. Hopefully we do. We get another dispatch object. So now we have a method for being able to work with that particular object. So maybe I have another question. Maybe I say, okay, well, I have this range dispatch object back. Does the range object have a property called value? Lo and behold, it does. It does have a property called value, and the IDispatch for that property is 6. So you can kind of see what's going on here. You can go, in some cases, very deep, depending on how high up you are in the hierarchy, but it's basically just going to that next one and then asking a new question. Again, we'll see in later videos how we can get all the properties of method for a particular object. But now, hopefully, this is starting to make a little bit more sense. This is simply the IDispatch. So for item, it's 170. LCID, they define way up above. This one is now a property. And then here, we'll see in the next example, these are going to be simply parameters that we're defining. And then finally, we have the argument for this particular method. So it takes one argument, index, and then they're just saying default name, not option argument. So that's, again, just for your purposes. So now we're starting to be able to look at this code and understand actually what's going on behind the scenes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one and we will play around with it a little bit more. But now we're going to use the Invoke Types method. What's the difference between Invoke and Invoke Types? Well, I wish I could give you a clear answer, but I couldn't find a clear answer. I looked at it, and for the most part, this is kind of what I've boiled it down to. With Invoke, we're not really defining anything about what's being sent through and what's being sent back. With Invoke Types, we're defining what's being sent through with this parameter result type description. So a tuple describing the type of the result. So this is saying, well, what's being sent back to me? And then we have another parameter called type descriptions, a sequence of tuples describing the types of parameters for the function. So we're going to be able to define the data type of our parameter and what we expect that parameter to do when we pass it through. That's really all. Let's kind of just start getting the example set up, and then we'll kind of see what it's supposed to be looking like. So I can pretty much copy all of this. And I'll keep this the same, this is the same, this is the same. But now we're going to start changing stuff down here. So here we're going to define the type of our result. That's really of our result sent back to us. We'll call it result type description. And then from here, it's a tuple. The first one in this example is going to basically say what is being sent back to us. Well, with the property, we get back a dispatch object. So we call Pythoncom VT dispatch. And then there's something called contain fields. And in this example, the contain fields are basically undefined. They're empty. We're not really saying anything about them. So we say Pythoncom VT underscore empty. So going back here, we've now defined the first part of this. Here's a perfect example right here. We are saying it's a dispatch object or whatever it might be. Here they're using the enumeration, so that's kind of why it's hard, because you're seeing 9, but it's very hard to say what this is. I did find something somewhere, and I will put the links. I think it was here. God, where did I put it? Yeah, right here. There it is. I found something that I think is a comprehensive list. I got to be a little bit careful because sometimes these aren't lining up exactly, but this will give you a list of all the data types as potentially what can be sent back to us. And then I also have one for the parameter flags. So this will tell you what the parameter flag is, what the constant value should be, and then really what is it. We're going to be working with this one in a second, so I'll just save that for later. So I'm defining the type of my result. I need to also define the type of the parameters passed through. And so this one will be called type descriptions. And again, it's going to be a sequence of tuples. So in other words, a tuple within a tuple. I'm going to copy this one just to kind of get us started. My first parameter, and you'll see this very often, it's going to be variant. I'm not defining what it is. I'm kind of just saying it's this object, but I'm not telling you what it is. So I define the type, and then I define what I expect that parameter to do. How did I know that? I read the documentation. That's literally what I did. If I didn't have this little thing down here, I really don't know if I would have figured it out, to be honest. So really, this function returns no values and takes in 2 parameters. And then I said, well, what the heck is ParamFlag fin? I looked it up, and really what it's saying is parameter passes information from the caller to the callee. Callee is being our Excel, or in this case, our range object. So we're passing through information from us to it. And so we're going to change this to, in this example, sorry, I'm misspelling it again, flag fin. So our first parameter is going to be a variant, and we're passing it from us to the dispatch object. And then we're doing that exactly the same for our second parameter. So now we've kind of started filling this in. We've defined the result type, and we define the arguments, what the data type is, and what we're expecting those parameters to do. Our final component is now defining the parameters themselves. Well, we can keep that exactly the same. So I'm going to copy this. And then I'm going to keep that. I'm going to keep that. And then I'm going to change this to result type description. And then I'm going to add a new one called type descriptions. Yes. And then I need to change it from invoke to invoke types. Then ideally, I should get back my range dispatch. Voila, we do. And again, I should be able to take this wonderful method and I can be able to ask it any questions. And so I think, see, now I'm going to make myself look stupid. Oh, it does. So it has a property called font. So we can say this particular range dispatch interface has a property called font. Okay. So again, now we're kind of seeing what's going on here. But in both of these examples, I was just returning back another dispatch interface. What if we have a method? How would our method look? Well, let's again copy this and just change some information about it. So I'll insert a cell below. In this example, I want to get the DIS PID of our undo method. And so I'll call it undo ID, undo. Where do I have it? I'm sorry, I have to move my notes really quickly. Perfect. And then from here, I define this. That's going to be the same. This is changing. It's no longer a property. We're using a method. And then from here, what's being sent back to us? In this case, nothing. Nothing is being sent back to us. We're just doing something. So here, all we're doing is we are saying we are sending back nothing. And then from what I've been told, and this is the one I can't really say entirely, I believe it was ParamFlag fin. And again, that to me doesn't make a lot of sense, but I'll kind of just put it the way they had it because that was how they had it in the documentation. But basically here, again, we're saying that we're passing information. Well, basically what we're doing is we're saying this information is nothing and that we're passing it from the caller to the callee, basically. And then here, we don't actually have anything being sent through, but we still have to pass through an empty tuple. And then we're going to just change this to arguments. There are no arguments for the undo method. And then so we'll say undo dispatch. Invoke type, we're going to change this. Undo ID, that's the same, that's the same. And then I'm going to change this to arguments. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to snap this over here. Okay, and let's see what happens when we run it. There are array. Then I'd misdo something. Result type description, arguments. Oh, sorry. I don't know why I did that one. You don't need to pass through the arguments. Okay, so now we call the method and we can clearly see it's actually invoking it. So here we are. This is how we're controlling our Excel application. This is like as low as we can go. And we can now actually call methods ourselves using the invoke types method or the invoke method. So again, I really hope you guys found this more informative. Again, I'm not expecting you kind of to do this, but it's very important that we understand what's going on behind the scenes, because you're going to look at this and you're going to be like, what is all this? Like, how does it know? And really, what I wanted to do is I wanted you guys to be able to look at this and be able to read it. I didn't want you being all confused going, what is this? I don't understand what's being auto-generated. This was you being able to look at this and actually understand what is being kind of created for you. Again, we'll kind of go into more examples later about, really how to use it and everything like that. But at this point, I wanted you to understand what a dispatch interface was. Again, all you have to know is that the dispatch interface is our mechanism. It's our way of communicating with an object. Even though it's been implemented in a different language, even though it might have been implemented in C, we use our dispatch interface in order to communicate with that object in a very standardized way. And in our particular instance, our dispatch interface was related to OLE automation. We'll explain that in a later video, but that's what IDispatch is for. So if you have any questions about what we covered today, please put them down in the comments below. I'm sure I'll have lots. And then also, if you could, please make sure to like the video. We always appreciate the support. And if you're not already, please make sure to subscribe to the channel so that way you get regular updates as we release new videos. So I think what's coming up next is type info object and then type attribute object. Those are the kind of the two next big ones. So thanks again for watching, everybody. We will see you in the next video.